Good evening, everyone. Well, I'm delighted to welcome you to the 2024 Hersch Lauterpacht Memorial Lecture. The lecture is an annual three-part lecture series intended to mark the contribution of Sir Hersch Lauterpacht to the development of international law. The lectures are delivered annually by a person of eminence in the field of international, and it is my honor to welcome and introduce this year's speaker, Professor Beth Simmons. Professor Simmons is Andrea Mitchell, Penn Integrates Knowledge University Professor of Law, Political Science, and Business Ethics at the University of Pennsylvania. She researches and teaches in international relations, international law, and international political economy. She is perhaps best known, at least by this audience, for her multi-award-winning work on mobilizing for human rights, international law in domestic politics, in which she carefully and persuasively explores the conditions under which international human rights treaties can influence the behavior of governments and other actors. Professor Simmons has been elected to the National Academy of Sciences, the American Academy of Arts, the American Academy of Political and Social Sciences, and the American Philosophical Society. In this lecture, she will be speaking on the extremely timely and important topic of border governance in an interdependent world. As it is a lecture in three parts, we won't be taking questions at the end of this evening's lecture. Instead, please hold your questions until Friday and the specific Q&A session. So, Professor Simmons, we are delighted to have you here, and the floor is yours.
So the idea was to get an eminent scholar in international law to speak to you today, and you ended up with me. As you know, my work is really international law adjacent, is a fair way to put it. So I work in very sort of interdisciplinary ways and methods and topics. And that's what I'm going to try to do today. And I really appreciate this opportunity to come here. It's a terrific opportunity for me because there is just so much international legal expertise in this room, and I hope you all come on Friday so that it's not just me talking to you, so that I have a chance to learn something from your questions as well. That will make the whole thing worthwhile for me, is to hear your response to some of the things that I want to try to develop today in thinking about border governance in an interdependent world. So thank you so much for this opportunity. Professor Benvenisti initially invited me. He got detained, but he got his issues worked out. I had to do a rucksack being lost, and I'm so glad he found it. Thank you so much to him for inviting me, and to Professor Kumaran for not rescinding the offer when we found out he was in the queue to come for the discussion today. And so I very much appreciate being here. So my topic now for the next 3 days, and that sounds like a long time, I know, is international borders in an interdependent world. And that was alluded to in the introduction. My work has developed primarily in the area of international human rights, which I have a deep, strong commitment to. And now today I'm sort of thinking in an area about the problem of governing borders in an interdependent world where human rights increasingly are at stake in border zones, border areas, and the whole question of freedom of movement is in some ways contested, in some ways have exceptions to it in ways that we need to explore, and the borders are the sites for governing this kind of question. And so the moment that I was invited to give the Lauterpacht lecture, I knew for sure the topic that I wanted to put together, it would be on the topic you see up here. It seems to me topical, important, and fundamentally an interesting topic. Digging deeper, turned out it's not a topic where you just open a book on international borders and interdependence. Turns out that's a tricky area to sort of systematically do research on. You don't open a book. When you open a book that has to do with borders and international law, what do you find out about? You find out about the legitimate acquisition of territory. You find out the principle of dispute settlement and proper border drawing. But it never really gets us to the fundamental question that I want to deal with in the 3 days, which is the area of how do we govern now these places that we've set up between states to try to coordinate their jurisdictional edges one with the other. So that's really what I want to try to deal with here. And the main problem, it seems to me, is that people are very worried in this space. And so what I'm going to do today is actually set up the problem. Tomorrow there'll be more law. I want to kind of motivate why I'm even bothering to look at this at all. People seem very worried worldwide about their borders and the kinds of external pressures that they represent for a feeling of security, a feeling of sovereignty over their own futures, and mobility defying human rights denigration that is sometimes the response to bordering and these kinds of concerns. So what does international law have to say about that kind of problem? The themes are sort of familiar, and immediately we find sometimes that people break into camps over these things. So on the one hand, there are the border sovereigntists, and they insist that bordering is synonymous with sovereignty. And in another corner, we have a sort of more liberal perspective. The liberals remind us that people have universal human rights everywhere, without exception. And in yet a third corner, I guess we have people who are border abolitionists. And these are the ones that would just sort of rather, for whom borders are always and everywhere oppressive institutions. And if you know my work, you already know kind of where I'm going to fall in this kind of sort of set of ways of thinking about the issue. I'm going to fall, I'll just tip my hand to you right now. Big reveal, I can be liberal on this issue area. My sympathies and my research agendas have always been with the idea that there are such things as fundamental human rights and that we need to actually approach borders head on in this space. Border treaty, human rights treaties have long organized our rhetoric, our thinking, our analysis, our sense of legal obligation. What do the treaties mean? What do they require? How do we implement them? That type of thing. But it seems to me that unless we sort of head on deal with the issue of spatial exceptionalism for human rights around international borders, it's going to be hard to make any more progress. And I will be trying to show you today and tomorrow and in third day as well, that international borders have become places of exception. They've become places where states have carved out certain kinds of exceptions to principles of international human rights. They represent danger, risk, threat. I'll document some of that for you. And border control is increasingly spoken of and understood as a high national security concern. As a consequence, sovereigntists argue that borders need to be enforced at all costs. And this is the kind of narrative that is starting to take hold. And by the way, I think narratives are important. Narratives help set frameworks for what people are expecting what to do. Narratives set frameworks that then become part of the woven record of understanding and practice that then makes its way into the proper interpretation of the law. So I think we need to take this idea seriously. Some of these contending ideas about border sovereignty and that kind of thing. So it's not only important to understand universal human rights, we also have to confront borders. We need to understand them. We need to explore their purposes, admit to their complexities, and we need to get at their legal roots. And that's what I'm going to be spending some time on tomorrow. Perhaps then we have a chance, I think, to excavate some principles for their governance in accordance with broader international law. And so to tip my hand just a little bit further, you wouldn't know this about me because I've not published anything on this yet. I see borders as international institutions, not lines. And they are established in law, and their purpose is very clear to me. And that is that they are there to further the collective interest of the international community. And framed that way, then, we don't just speak about borders as being sovereign things. We think about state sovereignty. What a border does is mark off state sovereignty. It marks off state sovereignty for the other state. It creates my sovereign state, your sovereign state. But the thing in the middle is ours. And so it doesn't belong to either one. It's a set of rules and understandings for how we shall relate to each other. And so with that understanding, it opens up ways to be thinking about border government. So governance. So I expect we shall have an exciting next couple of days. I hope you will stay with me as the conversation unfolds. Today, I set the scene. I'm going to try to show you some things that are going on, what claims people are making about borders, what rhetorical frames they tend to use, what practices are in place. And then tomorrow, I'm going to make run at a theory of borders, informed by treaty law and informed by general principles of law. And the international law of, get ready for this, neighborliness. Something we don't talk about enough, but it has very firm roots in general principles of law. And it is a clear part, therefore, of the international legal system that we need to be thinking about. Finally, the hardest part will be on Thursday. What does border governance require? What legal principles are there that can be built on? Okay, so that's what the third session will primarily be developed around, that kind of a problem. And then, if you can hang with me, and I know it's a challenge for 3 days and add a fourth for questions, we can have an open conversation on Friday where not only I take your questions, I want to hear what you think as well about some of the issues that I try to raise. So let's get to it. All right. This is sort of gives a general sense of the introduction that I'm going to present today. I'll begin with a general introduction and then talk about just a little bit of a background about how international law has created a territorialized world that situates an enjoyment of human rights in a very particular way. I will document then the idea of border anxiety and then talk about how that relates to this idea, the idea of the sovereign border, and then a little bit about how the sovereign border plays not very well with the idea of universal human rights and draw some conclusions. So I think just to begin very simply, the international law is responsible for the territorialization of much of the world. I think we all know that. International law has been at the very root of anchoring political authority territorially, and the consequences, I think, as we all know, are very profound of that role that international law has played, with the partial exception of only Antarctica. As far as I know, the Earth's surface has been parceled out to states or maybe proto-states, entities on the way to becoming states. And of course, many of these entities don't fully control their territory, but it is very that international borders have a profound effect on human life. Astonishingly, but in 2016, 25% of the world's population, or about 1.87 billion human beings, lived within only 100 kilometers of an international land border. So that doesn't even include most of the United Kingdom. Okay, so it's just astonishing how populations' very lives, are affected by this phenomenon of bordering. And yet it seems to me that for the last 70 years, international law has kind of had this ambiguous relationship with international borders. On the one hand, we're all very familiar with the state territorial order, the idea that, that emanated from Europe, that set down very firm roots for state sovereignty and territoriality. Peace treaties, once upon a time, were practically synonymous with territorial agreements, and control over territory allowed the state to exploit land, populations, strategic locations that would contribute further to state consolidation. And in Europe, in particular, eventually, very fuzzy frontiers would gradually morph into the linear boundaries that we are familiar with today. It's a long torturous story that played out in very distinct ways across the globe. And I don't think there's one model that it's everywhere, quite obviously. But if we were to fast forward now from that period of state consolidation and border solidification and linearization to the 20th, sort of the middle of the 20th century, the territorial integrity norm and international borders become very clearly institutionalized at the core of the international state system, underlying non-negotiable bedrock of the international order, as reflected both in the League of Nations, but then especially in the United Nations Charter Article 2.4, which talks about territorial integrity of states. Border territoriality was so sacrosanct, in fact, that it was not even part of the Travaux Préparatoires. I can't find it in the records of the Travaux because nobody was arguing that this was the principle that we needed to sort of found the United Nations system around. So this was uncontested, the state territorial order in some sense. I don't mean where the lines were drawn. Of course, that was contested. But the idea of the territorialized states with borders was not. After the middle of the 20th century, though, something happens that creates a little bit of a inconsistency, tension might be the best word, with the state territorial order, and enshrined, I think, in a lot of the institutions that we are very familiar with. The General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, the World Trade Organization, the International Monetary Fund, sort of border-defying market forces began to become unleashed as the project of the establishment of the liberal international order began to take place over the course of the 60s, 70s, 80s, and especially in the 1990s, okay? And so this was a time period as well when the Universal Declaration of Human Rights stipulated a right to life, a range of economic and social rights, due process, freedom from torture, and a right of free movement. And it didn't matter sort of where you were to be able to enjoy these things. There's a contradiction brewing here. You can feel it, that on the one hand, we have an order anchored in territory. And on the other hand, we have an order that sort of erodes that sense of territoriality by having some of the principles that literally kind of move beyond, above, through international borders. So in my view, the territorial and the liberal order are not cut from sort of the same kind of architectural design, if you want to think of it that way. And in fact, to use kind of a metaphor of architecture, I think that we have the territorial order on the bottom level, and built upon that, sort of plopped on top of it, is the liberal order. And it reminds me of this, this building right here. Does anybody know where this is? It's in Antwerp, apparently. I've never seen this building. I think it's a fabulous metaphor for the kind of contradiction that international law was in the process of developing by this kind of traditional, grounded structure on the bottom. And above it, let's see if we can have another project. It doesn't work for everybody. Has anybody been in this building, by the way? Part of when I look at this building, it's not only kind of this clash of architectures, I also wonder how to get from one part to the other. And in a way, that's another interesting metaphor. How do these orders literally connect? How do you traverse between them? And it seems to me that very crucially, human mobility is kind of figuring out where to go between these two borders. Some people are very stuck in the very territorially governed space and cannot move outside and beyond the borders they would like to. They can't go up into that higher kind of global space that we all enjoy because, after all, we have powerful passports. We get visa waivers on a regular basis, and very little questions asked when many of us in this room try to travel internationally. But there's much of the world that can't sort of enjoy, perhaps, access to this kind of other order up here, the order of the kind of stars above. So the state territorial order governs cross-border human movement. That's the border. That is the architecture that's down here below. And yet universal human rights soars above in some ways. It extends across borders, but the right to free movement doesn't. Okay, so how do people enjoy their full rights if they can't get into or the other part of this order and structure? So this is a constrained right to free movement. And it's no minor matter. On the contrary, it's a major concession to this territorial order. Almost 1.3 billion people enter foreign states every year. That's a lot of crossing of borders. About 3.6% of the population alive in the world today, that would be 281 million people, have settled into states in which they were not born. More than 4 million people were seeking asylum in foreign states as of 2020. And you know what? That's not the end of it. Demographers see no end in sight to the mobility pressures that we can expect to experience. People around the world, I think, harbor contrasting expectations about mobility. And on the one hand, universal promises, and on the other hand, the limits to cross-border mobility I'm talking about. And so people have, there's this contrast and there's this difficulty that I think people have a hard time understanding, or they don't see as consistent, I suppose, is the other thing. That's sort of why we can have universal rights, and yet I am limited in these ways, okay? So I think that's an important thing to say. And I think there's been a reaction against this kind of liberal order, largely in a lot of the more developed states in the world. And so there's been, for example, a shifting sort of exclusionary identities that start to develop with the development of the far-right groups that want to, harden borders as much as possible. There's also been, I think, sort of a little bit of rethinking about sort of where we want to have our border be. And I think Brexit is a good example of that, kind of rebordering in some way to try to gain local control again. But the one I want to double down, the one I want to spend most time on today is that the states have doubled down on, many have doubled down on border control. And that is kind of the main sort of focus I want to make for the rest of this speech. It's the last of these, the border control issue that I really try to focus on. So border control. Let's think about what gives rise to the sort of feeling that we need to control the border. And I think it's very possible that we're facing an epidemic of border anxiety around them. And I think it's very broadly based. It's not just in a state or two, it's certainly the case in the United States of America. There's a ton of anxiety around the southern border of the United States. But I think it's more general than that. In an international order that's presumed to be comprised of these sovereign territorial states, and then you overlay it with liberal institutions of market integration, people become very suspicious about international borders. They worry about their security. They wonder about what's on the other side. Borders become moving and multiple. They're reasserted by some states in very astonishing ways, like when Russia literally has tried to forcibly move its border. So borders are contested, to be sure. In the United States, let me just point out a couple of very strange things that are happening. Almost every American policy that you can think of is hung up on the issue of border control. Our foreign policy is hung up on the issue of border control. Even our sort of internal relationships in the country are in a crazy way challenged. Recently, armed units of the Texas National Guard seized control of a park in Texas near the border, Eagle Pass, and denied access to the US border control. I wonder, when this kind of contestation is going on, there's some kind of anxiety on the ground. And evidence is growing, I think, globally of this as well. And so, to try to look at this far more systematically than just telling you how sort of neurotic my country is about border control, what we did was we looked at all of the speeches that were given in the United Nations in the yearly debates. We looked at them for 50 years. We divided them into two categories, those that are border relevant and those that are not border relevant. And we sort of wanted to kind of explore this idea that anxiety is growing. One thing we found for sure is that the proportion of border relevant references have gone up over time, pretty unambiguously. On the bottom, you see here the years from 1970 to the present, to 2020. And on the vertical axis, you see here essentially a measure of the proportion of border-related words in these paragraphs. Leaders are talking about borders much more than they used to. Well, this raises some interesting kinds of questions. Like, for example, what are they talking about? And front of mind perhaps would be something like Ukraine. Unfortunately, it's off the end of this graph. So I think that would be flying upwards even quite obviously. So this ends in 2020. And I think it's very interesting what we do see though by 2020. And that is topics related to non-state actors are actually on the increase as a proportion. Okay, so it is true that interstate relationships are high, but they're trending down. But what you see here are references to transnational crime, references to smuggling and trafficking, references to migration are all low, but trending way up. We also reference the same thing. And so essentially, this is a scenario in which border references have to do with kind of non-state threats, things that are out there that is not necessarily your neighbor, but it is kind of flowing across borders. And it's sort of this idea that this is an increasing concern in the United Nations. And then finally, you may wonder, well, good or bad? Is that a good thing? Maybe they're saying, we've got transnational crime under control. Turns out that's not quite what they're saying. Instead, what we tried to do was to now take a measure of the rhetoric in these speeches. And around this concept of anxiety, we found synonyms that are very strong indicators of anxiety and antonyms that are just the opposite. And we took these very same paragraphs and then we rated on the vertical axis, you'll see, we rated how anxious the rhetoric was. And this is what we see. Red here are borders only. High is more anxiety. Low is less anxiety. Blue is non-border references for comparison. So, look over the 90s, sort of, yes, there was high anxiety around borders during a lot of the Cold War period, perhaps. Look at the 1990s, we're starting to get relaxed about it. Look at that upswing since 2010. So these speeches, leaders around the world are conceptualizing borders increasingly as these places of risk and danger. And importantly, I think that is informing quite a bit of the rhetoric around international borders. The result also has been a good deal of border hardening, literally on the ground. So another thing we did was we looked at every place where a major highway crosses an international border in the world. We went in with Google Earth. We had a look to see how built up they are, like state presence. Is there a lot of state structure there? Are there buildings? Are there gates? Are there inspection areas? All that infrastructure for the state to present itself at the international border and control what's going on. Red means a lot of state presence. Green means almost none. And yellow is somewhere in between. Stop, go, caution. And this sort of gives you a sense of what the world looks like if we think about the border crossings of the world. Okay, so that's another interesting indicator. This doesn't consider the walls, by the way. Here's the border crossings. The walls are yet another thing. And the walls of the world are clearly on an upswing. We actually geolocated every single wall segment in the entire world, but I won't show you all the geolocation. Instead, I'll simply make the point that walls are increasing. They've got to be very near to 100 international walls built around borders at this time. So these are gathering signs, I think, of the world's securitization increasingly of border unilateralism and sort of, I can handle my borders myself, do what I want to do to create border control. And this is at least part of the result. Of course, this doesn't even include extraterritorial enforcement of borders as well, which is yet another layer of complexity. But I think a lot of this leads to kind of a new rhetoric around borders. And that rhetoric we can call sovereign borders. Is that phrase even make any sense to you? Think about that one, because it makes no sense to me, and I want to hear your opinion. Okay, so if you come Friday, please tell me if you think what I'm going to say now is off base, because to me it makes no sense to talk about sovereign borders. So there are some very real threats, to be sure, but the rhetoric is taking us away from cooperative threats to taking unilateral actions to deal with them, and the rhetoric actually shows it. Is anybody familiar with Hello? Is anybody familiar with engrams? This is a way you can kind of quickly get trends in language over time in published books and libraries. And so I just took two phrases, very simple little things, just a little visual thing. I took border agreement on the one hand and sovereign borders on the other, just to get a temperature take about the way the world is talking about borders. Red are agreed borders, and blue is sovereign borders. Something's going on here. There's a rhetorical shift that I am concerned is making its way into practice, into expectations about law, into definitions of entitlement, in ways that we, I think, need to be concerned. And unfortunately, it's not just a bunch of, literary blah, blah, blah. Turns out states are picking up on the same rhetoric and using it very explicitly for their border control. So, sort of one place that we can find this, for example, is in the area of when we look at the Australian government's program to intercept, detain, and deport maritime asylum seekers. What was it called? It was called Operation Sovereign Borders. The United Kingdom similarly has revamped its asylum program as well. I know people nodding, the name of it as well. Sovereign borders. Again, the idea that borders are somehow sovereign. And of course, a recent president of the United States, hopefully maybe not again, but we shall see, repeatedly hitched the idea of open borders to a loss of sovereignty and the construction of a wall with reestablished American sovereignty. Okay, so to me, this does not make any sense whatsoever. Okay, but it seems like that we need to sort of understand why this is. And do you agree with me on this? Borders are not legitimately, I don't think. The idea of sovereign borders is conceptually incoherent to me. Borders are not legitimately created by a unilateral fiat, but they're not yours. Hello. That's kind of one place to begin. They're not created by unilateral fiat, and they are certainly not sovereign entities of some kind. I think this group knows the definition of sovereignty, right? So it means that there's an entity that has legal authority with no higher legal authority above it, and that's not a border, right? Not a sovereign border in any way. None of these ideas of sovereignty really describe an international. It's important to distinguish between the sovereign actor on the one hand and the institution they have created in cooperation with other states on the other hand. The other thing is borders don't create sovereign states either. So my understanding is they are neither a necessary nor a sufficient condition for independent statehood. According to one authoritative formulation, none of the different sources of international law that are listed in Article 38(1) of the Statute of the International Court of Justice makes the existence of a state contingent upon the existence of a well-defined inventory. International borders are institutions that sharpen spatial limits of two sovereign entities, but that's not what makes the two political entities sovereign. And come to think of it, sovereign states have no explicit international obligation to delimit or to demarcate their borders either. At least I couldn't find one. Indeed, borders are not even mentioned in the United Nations Charter. Borders are not territory is. Borders are not. Nor in any of the sources of law on the rights and duties of states. I can't find it there either. To be sure, state sovereignty is territorial, no doubt about that. And the UN Charter requires that its members shall refrain in their international relations from the threat or use of force against the territorial integrity and political independence of any state, but that doesn't say anything about borders. So, but I see borders as being the way to operationalize the coordination of territoriality. That's the way I see it. In Thomas Schelling's sense of the word, where he talked about focal points to coordinate action. If we're going to have sovereign territories, we need a way to know, for years in my opinion, so we don't argue, we don't fight. If we don't want to fight, we won't fight, right? Because we will understand better what that indicates. So that's my way of the nonsense behind this idea of sovereign borders. And I hope I'm not too far off base there, because it just seems really clear to me that there's no basis in thinking of borders as sovereign things in international law. Instead, I see them as a coordinating institution. Border integrity can be thought of as a shared resource of the neighboring states, and indeed of the international community as a whole. We all have an interest in territorial integrity. We all have an interest in that. And the way we get there is to coordinate using international borders. So I want to leave you with this thought: while sovereignty over territory belongs to the state, the international border is ours to govern. More on that tomorrow, because that has a lot of implications for how that space is governed. So that's my way of thinking. It's an opening about so-called sovereign borders. But we still have this major problem on our hands. And what happens now when human rights meet this area of bordering? Borders are focal institutions that allow for coordination. That's their contribution to international peace and security. Borders impose distinctions too between jurisdictions, and that's their contribution to national independence and even to identity, if you want to think of it that way. These are both legitimate things, both legitimate things. But what is much less legitimate is using the guise of sovereign borders to justify border policies that risk violating universal, fundamental human rights. And unfortunately, both human mobility and border anxiety are both on the rise, and there's strong evidence that this is exactly what is happening in many parts of the world. So I wanted to talk for a minute about some of the things that are literally happening in these border spaces. I would say, I guess, that border control is inherently in some degree of tension with universal human rights. So we can even go back a step if we wanted to, and ask, what's universal about dividing people anyway, right? There's nothing universal about bordering, from the get-go. In fact, this is a fundamental tension in democratic theory. How do you even justify, if you're talking about universal principles, how do you justify taking compartments that are you going to distinguish between and among? And so borders are privileged in many ways as spaces in which things fundamental do not always apply. So, for example, I don't think that it's very clear that international law solved this problem. So, as privileged spaces, consider, for example, the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination, just to take a human rights treaty. It stipulates an absolute bar to racial discrimination in Article 5, for example, and elsewhere. But border exceptionalism, if you look at it closely, creeps back in subclauses D, 1, and 2, little 1, little 2, where we learn that this fundamental right only applies to movement within a country. Upon entering your own country, and only on your way out of all other countries. Okay, that's literally what the treaty says. The right not to be discriminated against on the basis of race has a crucial spatial exception. Another state. It's very hard to conclude on all forms of racial discrimination fully lives up to that name, especially even though it repeats the word all 42 times in one treaty. So there's this already, we're feeling a little bit of tension here. And as a result, trans-border mobility is felt as very highly racialized, as I think we all know. If we look at passport power disparity, for example, there's a large literature now that looks at the ways in which things sort of facially seem as though they're not. Racial discrimination literally do make their way into discrimination, and in particularly when it comes to mobility rights. And I think we can see some patterns. We can see some patterns here among these states. There's a lot of really interesting and very good work that looks at the ways in which sort of nationality sort of stands in for racial discrimination in a lot of ways when we think of mobility. The other thing I think it's important to kind of mention anyway is that international borders can affect citizens on the inside of the country too. Okay, so in many parts of the world, people who live within border zones do not have the same rights as their fellow citizens or residents. So in China, for example, civil rights in border zones are subordinated to coercive policies of ethnic assimilation and strategies that enlist local residents in China's civil military fusion approach to land border defense, which calls for people to sort of provide intelligence about border conditions and that type of thing. In the United States, 2/3 of all Americans live in the special 100-mile border zone in which the rights to search and seizure by CBP are heightened, and your car can be searched in those areas. So it's a very different set of rights if you're in that 100-mile zone. So Matthew Longo has talked about inward-facing exceptionalism of this kind in his book that talks about the other border problem. Okay, so these are places where all kinds of exceptions tend to reign. And I hope we don't decide to dismiss these acts of discrimination, these acts of differentiation lightly, but unfortunately it can get even worse than this. You know that. Some destination states use highly militarized strategies, methods, and concepts to enforce their borders. Saudi border guards are reported to have recently shot hundreds of unarmed Ethiopian migrants and asylum seekers, including children and women who were not, according to Human Rights Watch. During COVID, North Korea emulated East German Cold War policies and simply shot anyone without any questions asked who were found in the buffer zone between the two Koreas. Even democracies have used lethal force at their borders against civilians in ways that are very shocking, I think. The Indian Border Security Force, for example, has in the past carried out the state's shoot-to-kill policy at the Bangladesh border, and at times taking aim at villagers, for example. Shooting on sight is even on the rhetorical table in the United States. And there was one instance in which a radio talk show asked the inhabitants of Texas, what's the maximum kind of force that you're going to apply at the border? He responded, "We are deploying every local tool and strategy we possibly can. The only thing we're not doing is we're not shooting people who come across the border because, of course, the Biden administration would charge us with murder." Oh, but wait, because this morning I heard on the radio that actually a bill is making its way through the state of Arizona that does permit property owners to shoot people crossing the border if they're on their land. Yeah, okay. Pretty extraordinary, it seems to me. It's not law yet, it's making its way, but there's almost a kind of a competition to see how tough you can get around US borders. So let me just sort of then say, sort of segue into the issue of deterrence as a border strategy itself, okay? Sometimes threats to commit human rights violations is the point. That's the point. In many destination states around the world, human rights are violated intentionally as a strategy of deterrence. The theory is people won't try to cross international borders without authorization if the cost of doing so is too high. And one way of putting costs on people is to find ways to violate their human rights. So this is the logic, for example, behind intentionally intercepting migrants prior to arrival and pushing them back, As we know, there have been a lot of just terrible consequences to that. It happens at sea, it happens in the United States, but clearly this is an instance of something that is meant to, in particular, make them so uncomfortable, at so much risk, that they will decide to turn back. It's an open strategy in a lot of places. Border enforcement deterrence has really come dangerously close to torture, the international definition of torture. Torture in international law is any act that intentionally inflicts severe pain or suffering, physical or mental, on a person to coerce, punish, or intimidate them. The violation of international law when inflicted by or with the consent of a public official acting in their official capacity. Allegations of torture have been on the rise at border areas and by border control agents. It's been on the rise around the world. I could cite all kinds of sources for this, but I think the most authoritative one is a report by the Special Rapporteur on Torture, who concluded that as a result of both direct and indirect policies and practices adopted by states, that there's been just a very, very high increase in types of techniques that essentially constitute torture against irregular migrants. There's nothing new about torture, okay? So let's just stipulate, there's nothing new about torture, and social scientists have been measuring its intensity by state officials for years now. One of the best known measures for this is been put out there by researchers in Sweden who put together this VDEM data set that measures things like democracy and voting, and they have a measure for freedom from torture. And so we inverted that measure, had a look at change over time. And if you average it across all states in the world, it's actually improving. That is, there's less torture in the world over time. That's a good sign. Okay, so this is not my data. I didn't make up this data. It's out there. Swedes do a really good job of putting together a research infrastructure that we can all benefit from seeing this trend. But I organized a research team to do something different. And that is, give me reports of torture by border agents only. Pick them out. Pick them out of the Amnesty International reports, yearly reports, and let's look at what that data looks like. Okay, so we did that. We reported the agent torture. It's the opposite direction. It is literally the opposite direction. So what we have here, we have years between 1995 and 2020 on the bottom, and we can measure both the intensive margin, that is the average incidence of torture reported. That's on an upward slope. If all you're looking at is border control agents and immigration officers, and also the extensive margin, the share of countries where any torture at all was reported by their border agents or their immigration officials. Both of those measures, we can see it up. We can see that that's up. So these are very troubling signs, I think, for human rights around international borders. Agents of the state who are in charge of immigration and border control have used torture increasingly, I think this shows, over the past 25 years. So if you're a proponent of international human rights like I am, we don't only have a human rights problem, we have a border problem here. Something very special is going on in this space that I think we need to kind of counter head on. What's behind these trends? Why are border officials having apparently contrary, behaving apparently contrary to other kinds of actors in the state? After all, human rights don't make exceptions for border agents, do they? So, well, no, they don't make that kind of an exception. Nor do they make exceptions in certain places, although discrimination apparently, if you read the Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination, all forms of racial discrimination suggests that those aren't guaranteed exactly at the international borders, but somehow border agents are behaving differently. Militaries, police, paramilitaries, other political officials in this space, and I think we need to see if we can get to the bottom of this. So it seems to me that that's an important and an interesting question for us to be thinking about when we think about the nature of bordering and the nature of international law. Now, one might just be, let's just put up a barrier. Let's just sort of take this kind of discretion around internet work out of kind of reduce flows by simply building a wall. Now we can all walk away from it, right? Well, it turns out it doesn't quite work that way. The Special Rapporteur's report on migration also mentioned the indirect torture associated with border enforcement and policies, including policies of long and almost impassable kinds of structures on the borders. Now, I've ridden around with Border Patrol agents. I have been in the cars of sheriffs trying to enforce the border. They'll tell you that, they're, and not just in the United States, by the way, even in the very north of Norway, where it meets Russia, where it's a fence, it's only about like 200 yards or something, 200 meters. But, they'll argue that that helps us with crowd control. It can be a very useful thing. But sometimes these kinds of structures have different kinds of consequences. If it's long and impassable, but it essentially forces people to do is to reroute into very dangerous areas. And this has been really well documented in the United States. There's been forensic evidence, for example, on the ground that looks at human remains and maps them geospatially in relationship to where the wall is extended and where certain kinds of monitoring structures are in place. And it can tell from the human remains that, in fact, they have suffered massive energy losses the more that they have had to be forced away from these very highly monitored places. So, so enhanced border surveillance literally is driving people away from the kinds of passages in which they might potentially have a chance to survive. Perhaps the thought of walling assuages some people now, though, that they have taken a neutral stance on the border, that they're not like intercepting migrants. But let me just sort of put this out there, that walling is not always quite as passive as some people might hope. It's part of a system of control. Okay, so return to a moment to the torture study I was just talking about that we did, where general torture is down, border control torture is up. I was wondering what causes that border control behavior. So we can explain that upward trend, essentially, in behavior by border officials in particular. When we examined the data closer, we found that the torture reports for border and migration officials spiked upwards in the first 3 years after a state announced that it was going to build a wall on its border. So this raises some interesting questions. What does it signal to border control? That this is such a high priority that we're going to put millions and millions of dollars into the structure on the border. And I don't know for sure, but I have a theory that a lot of what causes this kind of reaction is that this is a signal to enforce the border at all costs. And so that's the sort of a message that I think is giving license in spaces like this to, in fact, take the kinds of exceptional programs and enforcement techniques that are being chosen on borders. So we enter a kind of a world of exceptionalism here, when the idea is that the state is signaling that one can enforce the border at all costs. So let me just conclude now, almost just about on time, with a few thoughts and a little hint at what's coming tomorrow. These trends, border anxiety, hardening, these sovereignty claims, sovereigntist claims, I would almost say, and rights violations, they really should be encouraging us to think carefully about how international human rights norms can be realized in a very intensive way. So my ambition is I'm not going to offer a policy to solve everything, or a treaty or model legislation in some kind of a fully elaborated form. That's not going to happen by the end of 3 days. I still hope I see you back, but that's not going to happen by the end of 3 days. You know, and in many ways that's okay, because in some ways legal and quasi-legal instruments have outrun states' willingness to live up to them. Many documents, I think, address the well-being of migrants, but have received only tepid support from the international community. I think we can put the 1951 Refugee Convention, sadly, I think we can put that convention in this category. It has broad support on paper, but far weaker support at international borders, where asylum seekers are literally being blocked and pushed back from asserting their rights under this agreement. The International Convention on the Protection of the Rights of All Migrant Workers and Members of their Family, it doesn't even create new rights. It doesn't even do that. It just says, and it doesn't give them a right to work in your country either, of course. But it says, if they're in your country, guard their human rights. Okay. Yet, only 4 members of the OECD countries have ratified this agreement, and they are Mexico, Chile, Turkey. Not a lot of enthusiasm for thinking about the well-being of migrants. All states have signed on to the New York Declaration for Refugees and Migrants. All states have done that. Maybe one reason it's a comprehensive vision for how to handle displaced persons, arms. But you know, it's largely not binding. So perhaps that was one reason why so many states. And even so, before a vote on this non-binding pact could get underway, the United States withdrew from the process, stating that we will decide how best to control our borders and who will be allowed to enter our country, direct quote this is. The global approach in the New York Declaration is simply not compatible with the United States sovereignty. In my view, we need these agreements. So I'm not trying to substitute them out with something else. You know, my roots are in studying international human rights, and we can't stop saying that they're universal. They are indeed universal. But what I think is very urgent is that we need to reverse some of this border exceptionalism. We need to encounter it very directly and very hardening of international borders. This needs to be countered as well. Rights are literally frustrated by the enforcement of harder and harder borders. And the purposes of these lectures, then, what I'm trying to do here, what I will be trying to do over the next 2 days, then, is to sort of broaden, maybe retool our legal thinking about borders themselves in order to kind of have some way to resist the legal and ethical logic used by some very hard borders, border exceptionalism, and so-called sovereign borders. As I will discuss more in detail tomorrow, the international law of borders encodes norms of cooperation. It's going to sound counterintuitive, I think, to a lot of people, to some people, but they encode norms of cooperation that are meant to stabilize relationships between states. In contrast to contemporary claims, if borders are in any way exceptional in international law, it is in the direction of privileging the collective good. I'm going to make that case tomorrow, so get ready for that one, and not some unilateral assertion of national interest. We will see this in treaty law, for example. Okay, so this is something I just a little thread I want to try to pull on here. Border institutions that secure a collective good in which the international community has an interest borders need to be understood that way as institutions in which the international community has a collective interest. Borders have had, in fact, they've helped the states to coordinate, in Schelling's sense, the management of their territorial integrity. That's a public interest, in some sense, in the international system. Borders create 3 things: 2 sovereign states and an agreement between them that affects their relationships, one with the other. Delimiting an international border distinguishes these sovereign states and creates a mode of rule-governed relationships between them. So I'm going to develop the point tomorrow that international borders are not just focal points. They are that, but they are also relational institutions. A border is a marker of sovereignty, but it's also a wedge that creates obvious social and economic disruptions between states. Non-state actors, entities of all kinds are going to have incentive to challenge this wedge. Having created such a wedge, states have a responsibility to govern it, to deal with it in ways that are very consistent with international law. So I'm drawing from some unusual bodies of law, general principles of law, and a little bit about property tomorrow. And indeed, the international law of neighborliness as well. So this is an area which international law kind of only whispers in, okay? But I think what we need to try to do is to try to draw out this whisper and think about the ways that international law speaks not only to bordering, but to border governance as well. So I hope I see you back tomorrow to take up some of these themes. And thank you very much for listening.
Since you've already given us so much food for thought, we look forward to tomorrow's lecture. Thanks everyone for coming, and we'll see you same time tomorrow.